Margaret Ann Calloway was 31 years old. She stood 5'4", weighed 118 pounds, and had a habit of tucking a single photograph of her daughter behind her library card, the way some women tuck lucky coins. On the morning of September 14, 1983, she drove her rusted 1977 Ford Fairlane out of the gravel driveway of her home on Buckner Road in Harlan County, Oklahoma, and waved to her neighbor through the windshield. She never came back. That is not a story about a woman who walked away from her life. That is a story about a predator who had been watching from close range for a very long time. And it would take 40 years, 3 separate sheriffs, the retirement of a man who never stopped thinking about her, and a technology that didn't exist in 1983 to finally expose him. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that September morning. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Margaret Calloway was. Harlan County, Oklahoma, in the early 1980s, was the kind of place that time seemed to treat gently. The county seat, a town called Delwood, had a population of just over 4,000 people, and on any given morning you could walk the length of Main Street and be greeted by name at least a dozen times before you reached the feed store at the far end. Neighbors kept spare keys to each other's houses, as a matter of course. Children rode their bikes to school alone. The American Legion Hall on Oak Street hosted fish fry fundraisers on the second Friday of every month, and the parking lot was always full. It was the kind of Oklahoma town that still smelled like cut hay in the summer and wood smoke in October, where the evening news was watched over the same dinner that had been cooked in the same kitchen for 20 years. Margaret had lived there her whole life. She was a licensed practical nurse at Delwood Memorial Hospital, working the early shift on the maternity ward, a job she had chosen not because it paid well, it didn't, but because she liked being present for beginnings. She was the kind of nurse who remembered patients' names long after their charts were filed. She was 31 years old, the mother of a 6-year-old girl named Cassie, and the daughter of Robert and Eunice Calloway, who still lived 4 miles down the same county road in the same house where Margaret had grown up. She checked the locks on her doors twice every night before bed, a habit her ex-husband had always teased her about. She drove a car that needed a new muffler and kept promising herself she'd get to it. She had a vegetable garden in the backyard that she tended on her days off, and she had just started canning tomatoes for the winter. That last batch sat in her kitchen in labeled jars when they opened the door 3 days later. The morning of September 14th was a Wednesday. Margaret's shift started at 6 in the morning. She was seen leaving her house by her neighbor, Doris Wempley, at approximately 5:40 a.m. Doris watched her from the kitchen window, the way she always did, and Margaret gave her the usual wave from inside the car. It was still dark. The Ford's headlights swept across the gravel and then turned south toward Route 9. She never arrived at the hospital. By 7:15 a.m., her charge nurse placed the first call to her home. No answer. By 9 a.m., the hospital called Robert Calloway. He called back 20 minutes later to say her car wasn't in the driveway. By noon, the Harlan County Sheriff's Office received the first missing persons report. Deputies found the Ford Fairlane at 4:47 that afternoon. It was parked on the gravel shoulder of County Road 14, approximately 3 miles from Margaret's house, in a stretch of road bordered by a stand of blackjack oak. The driver's side door was unlocked. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her keys were in the ignition. The engine had been off long enough to be completely cold. Inside the purse, deputies found her wallet. Inside the wallet, behind the library card, was the photograph of Cassie. She had not run. She had not left. Whatever had happened fast. Sheriff Dale Pruitt took personal charge of the investigation within the first 48 hours. Pruitt was a methodical man, 52 years old, with 20 years in the department and a reputation for being difficult to shake. He had grown up in Delwood. He had known the Calloway family most of his life. As investigators canvassed the stretch of County Road 14 for a quarter-mile in both directions and turned up a tire track in the soft shoulder that didn't match the fair lane. It was a wider track, consistent with a pickup truck. A partial boot print was recovered from the embankment beside the passenger door, suggesting someone had stood there, on the opposite side of the vehicle, possibly waiting. Two persons of interest emerged in the early days. The first was Margaret's ex-husband, Gary Plummer, who had relocated to Tulsa after their divorce 2 years earlier. He was cooperative with investigators and produced time-stamped receipts placing him at a diner in Tulsa on the morning of the 14th. He was eliminated within the week. The second was a man named Dennis Holt, a mechanic from the neighboring town of Claremore who had been seen at the hospital twice in the weeks before Margaret disappeared, though no one could identify why. Investigators interviewed him twice. He had no alibi for the morning in question, but no physical evidence tied him to the car or the road. After 6 weeks of failed attempts to build a case, Holt remained a person of interest on paper, but was never charged. The partial boot print was photographed and filed. The tire track was cast in plaster and stored in the evidence room at the sheriff's office. A single cigarette butt recovered from the embankment near the passenger door was bagged, tagged, and sent to the state crime lab, where it was logged and set aside. In 1983, a cigarette butt was evidence of presence, nothing more. Margaret's parents drove County Road 14 every morning for 6 months, looking out the windows. Robert Calloway walked the tree line behind the shoulder 3 times with 2 neighbors and a dog. The Delwood Gazette ran her photograph on the front page twice. The American Legion posted a reward of $500, then raised it to $1,000. None of it produced a single new lead. By the spring of 1984, the active investigation had been reduced to a periodic status check. Sheriff Pruitt still pulled the file on quiet afternoons. He had told Robert Calloway directly, "This case is not closed." But the county had other business, and the months had a way of passing even when you were paying attention. Cassie Calloway turned 7 without her mother, then 8. Eunice Calloway kept a framed photograph of Margaret on the piano and refused to move it, not once, in the years that followed. Robert Calloway developed a heart condition in 1989 that his doctor told him was partly stress-related. He said nothing about it to the new sheriff, who had taken over when Pruitt retired in 1991. By 1990, 6 years had passed. The house next door to Margaret's had been sold twice. The Fairlane had been released from impound and eventually crushed. The evidence boxes from the original investigation sat in a climate-controlled storage room at the Sheriff's Annex building, labeled in Pruitt's handwriting, the labels beginning to yellow at the edges. Dale Pruitt retired to a small house on the east side of Delwood in 1991, but he kept a single cardboard box in his spare bedroom. It contained photocopies of the original case file, his personal notes, and an 8x10 photograph of Margaret Calloway that her mother had given him in 1984. He read through it every year or two. Not obsessively, he was not that kind of man, but regularly. The way you check on something you haven't forgotten. By 1997, 14 years had gone by. The people who had known Margaret were aging. Some had moved. Her daughter Cassie was 20 years old, studying at Northeastern State and carrying the particular weight that children of the missing carry. The not knowing that is worse, in some ways, than knowing. Eunice Calloway had slowed considerably. Robert Calloway had his 3rd heart event in 2001 and spent 3 weeks in the same hospital where Margaret had worked. The reward poster that had hung in the window of Holtman's Hardware on Main Street had faded to near white by 2002. Nobody took it down. The case had been cold for 22 years when Dale Pruitt drove to the sheriff's annex on a November morning in 2005 and asked the records clerk if he could sign out the original evidence boxes from the Calloway case. He was 74 years old, officially retired for 14 years. The clerk asked if he needed an escort. He said he just wanted to look. He brought the boxes to the conference room and spread everything on the table. He spent 4 hours going through it. The tire track cast, the photographs, the field notes, the cigarette butt in its original evidence bag, which had been transferred from the state crime lab back to county storage sometime in the mid-90s. He made a single phone call that afternoon to the current sheriff, a man named Tom Arquette. He said, "The technology exists now to do something with this cigarette butt that we couldn't do in 1983. I think we should try." Sheriff Arquette submitted the cigarette butt to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation in early 2006. The OSB extracted a DINA profile from the saliva on the filter, a complete male profile, clean and unambiguous. The profile was entered into CODIS, the National DINA database, and returned no match. Whoever had smoked that cigarette on the shoulder of County Road 14 in September 1983 had no DINA on file with any law enforcement agency in the country. The case went back to waiting, but now it had a profile. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Margaret. Then, in the winter of 2021, something happened that no one in Harlan County had anticipated. A genealogist working under contract with the OSB, a woman named Rachel Voss, who had spent most of her career working adoption cases, was reviewing a batch of cold case DINA profiles that had been cleared for submission to public genealogy databases. The process worked by uploading the crime scene DINA to ancestry websites where ordinary people trace their family history, and then following the genetic threads through distant relatives until they converged on a single unknown person. It was painstaking work. Most profiles generated dozens of family branches, each one requiring weeks of manual research. Rachel had worked cold cases before where the process took a year or more. The Calloway profile took 11 weeks. On a Tuesday morning in February 2022, Rachel Voss was cross-referencing a family tree branch traced back to a great-uncle in northeastern Oklahoma when a name appeared that made her stop. She pulled the supplemental notes from the original case file, read them twice. Then she picked up the phone and called the OSB case supervisor assigned to the Calloway investigation. The name that had emerged from the genealogy database belonged to a man whose closest verifiable relatives lived within 40 miles of Delwood, Oklahoma. His branch of the family had been in Harlan County for 3 generations. His name was Roy Calvin Mercer. He was 71 years old. He had lived his entire life in the town of Kellerton, 6 miles from Delwood. He had worked for 32 years as a rural mail carrier for the United States Postal Service, retiring in 2009. He attended the First Baptist Church of Kellerton. He was known in town as a quiet, reliable man who waved from his car and helped neighbors with fence lines. He had delivered mail on County Road 14 for most of his career. He had known Margaret Calloway's family by name. He had delivered their mail. The OSB moved carefully. Investigators obtained a discarded coffee cup from outside a gas station Mercer frequented and submitted it for DNA analysis. The profile from the cup matched the profile from the cigarette butt on the shoulder of County Road 14, with a probability exceeding 1 in a trillion. Roy Calvin Mercer was arrested at his home in Kellerton on the morning of March 8, 2022, by a joint team of Osby agents and Harlan County Sheriff's deputies. He answered the door in his bathrobe. He looked at the agents, then at the warrant, and said nothing. He was handcuffed on his front porch. A neighbor 2 doors down watched from her driveway, her hand over her mouth. A man who had waved at her every day for 30 years was placed in the back of a county vehicle and driven away. He was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a guilty plea in September 2022 to avoid trial, and in his allocution, the brief statement defendants make before sentencing, he said 3 words to the judge: "I am sorry." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When Cassie Calloway spoke to reporters outside the courthouse that afternoon, she was 45 years old. She had spent 39 years not knowing. She said, "I always believed someone who knew her did this. I always believed she didn't go far. I want people to understand she was a real person with a real life, and she deserved to come home." She was right about all of it. Margaret Ann Calloway was 31 years old on the morning she drove out of her gravel driveway and waved through the windshield. She was a nurse who liked beginnings. She was a mother who kept her daughter's photograph behind her library card. She had a garden and a door she checked twice every night, and a car that needed a new muffler, and a family that loved her, and a community that had known her all her life. She had a future that was hers by right, and it was taken from her on a dark September morning by a man who had smiled and waved from a mail truck for years. The worst kind of ordinary, hiding the worst kind of secret. The cigarette butt sat in a labeled bag in a county storage room for 39 years. The technology to read it arrived before anyone came looking. When they finally did look, it answered every question that 1983 couldn't. There are still thousands of cold cases in this country with biological evidence sitting in storage, waiting for someone to ask the right question with the right tool. Margaret's case asks us to consider what justice means when it arrives 4 decades late, whether it is still justice, whether it is still peace, and what it costs a family to carry that question for a lifetime before they get an answer. What do you think of a sentence that amounts to a man spending his final years in prison for a crime he committed at 31, the same age Margaret was when he took everything from her? What detail in this case stayed with you longest? And what does it say about the communities we live in that the people most capable of harm are sometimes the ones we trust most completely? Justice came for Margaret Calloway after 39 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.